Hello and welcome to the first in a two-part series that I've designed to help you use quotes more effectively in your analytical writing. Before we look at how we use quotations, let's take a quick minute to think about why we use quotations. In order to understand why we use quotations, it's important to understand exactly what an analytical essay or analytical writing is. When writing analytically about literature, your job is to explain what certain elements of the text mean and also why the author made the decisions he or she made. The analysis you offer is, by definition, your opinion. When I discuss opinions in analytical writing, I like to call them claims or arguments. And each time you make a claim in your analytical writing, you must support it with specific evidence from. The most specific type of evidence for supporting your claim is, of course, a quotation. You can't get more specific than using the exact words the author used. Quotations are often the best kind of support for your analysis. Now that you understand why quotes are necessary in analytical writing, let's take a look at how you should use quotes in analytical writing. The first step is probably the most important, and we're not even going to address it in this screencast beyond this one slide, but it's important to know that the quote you choose should be the one that best supports or illustrates your claim. Once you've identified the best quote, it's time to put it into your paper. The first thing you're going to do when you put it in your paper is introduce it with context. Next, you will blend that quote into your essay in a smooth, seamless. And finally, you will analyze the quote. There are three basic methods for integrating a quote into an analytical essay, and we're going to discuss each in detail. But here's a quick preview. The first method for integrating a quote is probably the most common method, and it's certainly the most basic. In this technique, you simply identify the speaker before the quote and then use a strong expression verb to lead into the quote. After the expression verb, you have to put a comma. That's punctuation rule number 7. Let's look at a few examples. Mr. Dawson lamented, "My poor UNC Tar Heels just weren't built for success in this year's tournament." Mr. Dawson is the speaker, and lamented is the expression verb. Notice that there's a comma after the expression verb and before the quote. Mr. Dawson whispered softly, "Don't worry, my poor children. This screencast will be over before you know it." Once again, Mr. Dawson is the speaker, and whispered is the expression verb. Softly is an adverb that modifies the expression verb and gives the reader even more information. The comma comes just before the quote. On the last screen I mentioned expression verbs, and you may have been wondering what an expression verb is. Most expression verbs deal with speaking, but they can also deal with thinking or writing. Essentially, any way that a person can communicate is an expression verb. This is a list I've put together of some strong expression verbs. They're sort of grouped by category, but there are literally hundreds more. The most important thing to remember is to never, ever use the expression verb says, or any iteration of that. So say, says, said. Don't use it. Use a more specific, precise expression verb, like the ones above. The second method you can use for incorporating a quotation is by using a complete sentence followed by a colon. The complete sentence explains your claim, and then after the colon, you give the quote. Obviously, then after the quote, you give analysis. As his coach explained, Mr. Dawson never really had a chance at playing in the NFL. Colon. His arm was too weak, his feet were too slow, and his decision-making was horrendous. Come to think of it, he really sucked. The important thing to remember here is that you can only use a colon after a complete sentence. Mr. Dawson's friends make fun of him too. Colon. That guy is such a joke. I can't believe he's educating our nation's children. The future looks bleak. You can't put that colon after to unless it's a complete sentence. The third technique for integrating quotes is the most sophisticated, and not surprisingly, it takes the most practice to get good at. With this with this technique, what you'll do is blend the quote into your own sentence as if the words were already a natural part of the sentence. Or in other words, you could start a sentence with your own words and then finish it with the words from the text. For example, Mr. Dawson rifled through his filing cabinets only to discover that, quote, all of his baby pictures had been stolen by his mother. That sentence would make just as much sense without the quotes as it does with it. That's what I mean when I say that it becomes a natural part of the sentence. Notice that you don't need to use a comma here because there's no expression verb introducing the quote. Mr. Dawson's not exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer. In fact, he once pushed his car into his father's house, breaking a large column on the porch in half. That's a true story. Now that you've learned 3 ways to integrate your quotes, you're ready for the most exciting and appetizing part of this presentation, sandwiching. If there's only one word that you remember from this entire screencast, I want it to be sandwich. Always, always, always sandwich your quotes. When constructing a quote sandwich, the first slice of bread is context. You must introduce all of your quotes with context. Context answers the types of questions a detective would want to know after a crime, the who, what, when, where, why, how questions. This may seem cumbersome, but it's really not. Typically, all of the relevant context for a quote can be provided in less than 1 sentence. Let's take a quick look at examples of context using all 3 methods of integration that we just looked at earlier. The first method, remember, is to identify the speaker and use a strong expression verb before the quote. While jumping out of the bedroom window in a desperate attempt to escape from the police, Mr. Dawson shouted to his wife, "Honey!" There's a lot of context in this introduction to the quote. You know who, when, why, and where. The second method for integrating a quotation is to use a complete sentence followed by a colon. Under the dim glow of the interrogation chamber's lone light bulb, the detective looked scornfully at Mr. Dawson and decided to play bad cop, colon. Listen up, you son of a... This context lets the reader know who is speaking, to whom they are speaking, where the conversation is taking place, and how the detective is going to speak. The third method for quotation integration is to blend the quotation into your own sentence as if it were words from your own sentence. Before Mr. Dawson entered the courtroom, his attorney, with tiny beads of sweat beginning to escape from his forehead, quietly explained to Mr. Dawson that if he did not plead guilty, he would surely fry in the electric chair. Notice that there's no comma before the quote because there's not an expression verb. Now, the best part of any sandwich is obviously whatever comes between the 2 slices of bread. Not surprisingly, in a quote sandwich, the filling, the meat, is the quote itself. And we've already covered this. Simply pick a quote that supports your claim and integrate it seamlessly into your essay. The final delicious piece of bread in a quote sandwich is analysis. Every time you use a quote, you must follow it with analysis. And there's 1 or 2 different types of analysis that you can follow a quote with. The type of analysis you'll use most often is to simply explain how your quote supports your claim. Be specific. The second kind of analysis you can have after a quote is to explain the literary devices employed by the author in the quote. Let's take a look at a couple of examples for each type of analysis. First, let's look at the more common type of analysis, which is the type of analysis that explains how the quote exactly supports your claim. In this example, we have a quote, which is not listed here. It's indicated by these ellipses. And then we're going to follow that quote with analysis. The analysis here is Mr. Dawson's thoughtless remarks clearly demonstrate his insensitivity to the feelings of others. This would explain how the quote you just read supports the claim which came before the quote. In the second example, you have a quote followed by the analysis. Mr. Dawson's reply to the angry man in the parking lot indicates a complete absence of. Based on this analysis, it's safe to assume that the claim preceding the quote is something like, Mr. Dawson is a coward, and that the quote itself was something like, please don't hurt me, please don't hurt me. Now let's take a look at the second kind of analysis that you can use following a quote. In this kind of analysis, you explain the literary devices employed by the author in the quote. This is a very specific look at the actual words in the quote. In the first example, we have a quote followed by this analysis. The simile the author used comparing Mr. Dawson to a wastebasket clearly displays Mr. Dawson's complete lack of integrity. We can assume from this analysis that the quote would have been something like, the contents of Mr. Dawson's character are quite similar to the contents one would find inside of a trash can. Although I guess to be a simile, it should say, the contents of Mr. Dawson's character are like the contents inside of a trash can. In the second example, we have a quote, and then the writer draws readers' specific attention to the words I, me, my, and mine to inform the reader that this use of first-person pronouns suggests Mr. Dawson only cares about himself. And that concludes part one of my two-part series on the effective use of quotations in analytical writing. Please tune in to part two of my presentation to learn more about citation and punctuation and other terribly annoying things you have to worry about when working with quotes.